You are looking at the insides of an Einstein Avatar, comprised of 101 chatbots, each an expert at some part of Albert Einstein's life, and they're all linked together by several kinds of probabilistic topologies. Reds are indicating outbound connections, and blues indicating inbound connections, and yellow are about as many in blue as red, so it becomes yellow. And when you turn on Einstein Avatar, you may start with the conversation asking him about his first wife, his children, his affairs with women, or maybe something as simple as, if he had a favorite food, what he did to relax. And to relax, he might say, well, sometimes I would go sailing, or sometimes I would play Mozart violin, which would then get you to the history of, he might talk lamentably about how only Wagner was in vogue during the Hitler years in Germany. And that might lead you to talking about, well, why did he write a letter to President Roosevelt if he was about, peace and not about war? And he'll answer, probably will answer, well, because we were afraid the Germans were ahead of us to the bomb program. I took the liberty, since I was building these 101 files, of making Einstein Avatar cognizant of current world history and cognizant of current world science. So you can talk to this Einstein Avatar not only about the history of, early blunders, vortex atoms in the previous century to him, but you can talk to him about string theories, the Large Hadron Collider, gauge theories, his thoughts on if there's a final theory of the universe, multiverse, limits of knowledge, the James Webb Space Telescope, modified gravity, any connections with Feynman, today's current gravitational wave astronomy with LIGO and Virgo. You can talk to him on quite a lot of things, and as your conversational arc goes around, you will be pulling from these links logically put together events or facts or thoughts from Albert Einstein's life on what he thought about what you're interacting with him. This dot right here where the mouse is at is one of the trivia files on a lot of personal history. I blew up that dot, and here is a subject matter expert on a lot of his life. Here is the beginnings of his meeting Mileva, his first wife, of the courtship, of the marriage, of the fact that they had to give away a child out of wedlock before they got married, of the two other children. And he was actually quite abusive to this wife, Mileva. And one of the sons eventually developed mental health issues, and so Mileva ended up having a horrible life taking care of this son, despite the money that Einstein would send her. In fact, she herself succumbed to mental disorders, and that might link you to, one of Einstein's best friends, Ehrenfest, also had a son with Down syndrome, and Ehrenfest himself suffered from depression. He didn't think he was up to snuff to the physicists of his time, so he ended up killing his son with Down syndrome and then killing himself. You might go from this morbid thought to, well, how were you, Einstein? How healthy were you? How sickly were you? When did you die? And from there, you'll get all these connections over here. There's other paths to trivia. I mean, it turns out he was cremated, but the doctor that was around when he died actually stole his brain, and then there's a piece of his brain left at the Mutter Museum. So there's still a piece of him you can go and see. Some of his hobbies here: seafaring, the violin stuff, joking, sticking out his tongue in that famous picture that he really liked, that was Life in America, and essentially talking to effectively the young portion of Einstein in this chatbot. Going back to the bigger chatbot, I'd like to say also that within each one of these chatbot SMEs, subject matter experts, are a grand total of around 250 calls to Wikipedia, where it pulls in the summary paragraph of whatever might be of interest. Heavy water. What's heavy water? It'll give you the background information probabilistically. So this is designed to not act the same way as you interact with it. And if eventually you ask it the same question, you may or may not receive the same answer. And I built in some silly things like, if you ask it the same question twice, it'll go, you just asked me that question. If you ask it 3 times, it'll go, you just asked me that question. Ask a different question. Or if it's really stumped, it might say, I have nothing. Can you rephrase your approach? I will confess that it's not perfectly smooth like you're talking to a real person. It's clunky, it's mechanical, but it's a prototype technology to begin to build avatars that are rich enough. Possibly, this may be prototype technology, a prototype approach to develop digital companions, or for the marketers to build digital avatars of each and every one of us on Earth that are consumers. So let's play with Einstein chatbot and see, let's ask a question. What if not physics, what would you have done? I could type. If I had not done physics, what you have done? And history would know the answer to this question because Einstein talked about it.
Sure. I was drawn to physics, you could say attracted to physics by its beauty, by its subtleness, and I was good at mathematics, so I had no barriers to overcome with respect to physics in this personal sense, so I went into physics, becoming a decent physicist. It drew me in and it made me happy and productive. Pursue it if you love it, that's my advice. Related thoughts if any. Physics amplifies the beauties of our shared universe, not dullens it, as lay people might say of the worldview of scientists. Scientists see deeper and see far more connections with their predecessors and with existence. Let me see. Physics was not something I did by choice, all paths would have led me to it. Secondary thoughts or research topics. However, as Bruce Lee said, it is not the daily increase, but daily decrease. Hack away at the unessential. I would have liked to meet Bruce Lee. Secondary thoughts or research topics. I very rarely think in words at all. A thought comes, and I may try to express in words afterwards.
So I was asking if you wanted to be more verbose. I could have continued talking on. Sometimes it talks about advice for graduate students in America competing against Chinese who have been hyper-trained and already basically have their masters. So it'll talk about that, the books that are available. I can talk about the teachers that might have inspired him as well. And so you do get a varying experience depending on just a different session, or within the same session if you just continue to move around the conversation. And re-ask the question about physics, and you can see that now it added something about some of my best teachers were some of the most learned people in history. And so some slight variation, and then it continued asking, hey, do you want me to be more verbose? And I said no. So in the interest of time, I went ahead and started a session and said, hey, did you have a best friend? And the answer came back, Michel Besso and Michael Grossman were good friends of mine during this period where I was developing between special and general relativity. He formed a book club with friends that would go out and dine and have conversations. And then at the bottom, who he collaborated with. Let's try something about, did you have a favorite food? Something a little bit lighter. Did you have a favorite food? History will have something to say about that.
Yes. Did I like to eat food? Well, I liked eating breakfast food very much. I ate at least 2 fried eggs and mushrooms and honey. Related thoughts if any. Ahem. Vegetarian, only in my last year. I have always eaten animal flesh with a somewhat guilty conscience. It was difficult to resist. Reputedly my favorite food to eat was spaghetti. I did like eating it. Ahem. Sweets, dessert, cake, pies, yes, but really only my favorite dessert, orange cake. My favorite fruit was strawberries, but I ate other fruits as well, lots of vegetables before dessert.
Bear in mind, all these sentences are probabilistic. They may or may not have shown up. Let's ask something a little more serious. What did you feel about the Palestinian issue? The issue of Jews migrating after World War II towards Palestine, where there's clearly going to be conflicts over land that are ongoing as today.
Yes. Feel about Palestine and Palestinian issue, thoughts on Israel and the Palestinian issue. On the Palestinian issue, I favored the creation of a national home that would welcome Jewish immigrants and foster Jewish cultural development within the framework of a two-state binational state guaranteeing equal rights to Arabs.
Background information.
Related thoughts, if any. So, Zionism, my Zionism and my feelings for creating Israel would be barely recognizable today, because it did not include support for a Jewish-Israeli state including a two-state solution, a Euro no two-state solution.
There you see it pulling from, relevant material from Wikipedia. To phrase this in a more mathematical way, I think of there's a topology between chatbot I with its connections internal, which I blew up inside, and I showed you the personal one, connections between the I thought or sentence and the jth with some probability, and the sometimes links to the next chatbot that's nearby that is topically related, and it's an inner structure here with these probabilities. Of course, this is a very static picture, so let me throw in the element of time as well. We can imagine that when Einstein was born, that was a point, and that as time evolved, connections began to happen. And more time passed, more connections happened. And so there is a temporal way to do it. I was simulating that with a slide on edge thickness, but that could have very well been that the network is getting richer from birth all the way through death. When it comes to times, we actually have to think of that in today's networks, there are many different clock rates: seconds, minutes, hours, weeks, months, days, years, decadal periods, nanoseconds in our telecommunications, microseconds, etc. And so we actually think about that the network topology is going to be characterized by an additional index that considers the pairings of the networks that we're talking about, these probability linkages. I'm going to put together here a linear looking model for the time evolution of the network being proportional to itself times some sufficiently rich tensor operator here and stochastic noise. And we might think, okay, let me wind back the clock to 1940, and using back training data, we can, back testing data, we can see if we can predict how Einstein would evolve from 40 to 55, and you're going to crash. What you're missing is the rest of the world. You're missing Einstein's Princeton community. You're missing all the people in the cities and in the city and the state and the country and the nation states. And so what you would actually need to build is a sufficiently big, maybe the full world, maybe just a subset of the world, additions to the chatbot, and just by continuing to add files and linkages, and they're sufficiently orthogonal to each other that, say, if there's a rock star in it, it won't know anything about physics, and Einstein won't know anything about the rock star. However, even though this is a linear equation, we can consider higher order equations. Linear looking, I said, it already has the logistic equation inside of it. It has therefore a complex adaptive system with bifurcation, nonlinearity, catastrophes in the sense of differential equations, changes of phase. And so it might be that if we wind it back to 1940, we can predict for maybe 1 microsecond in the future before it falls apart. Who knows? Or maybe because there's things that are persistent, like the Liberty Bell, like the Egyptian pyramids, like the United States, like China, we might actually have some kind of predictive power that, as opposed to the United States sounding the alarm bells for that Russia was going to invade Ukraine relatively little time before they actually did. Maybe we can wind back the clock considerably further. On the other hand, I'm kind of dubious that these tools would be of some use, but maybe at smaller scales they might be useful for companies waging campaigns against competitors. And it would be just interesting to see if this is just a pipe dream of capturing the ability to predict the future to something useful, maybe weeks, if not anything, maybe even a few days, who knows. Switching gears to some other potentially useful approach to the chatbot construction method is that topology. I spent a year and a half, maybe 2 years, sorting it out, being a physicist myself, being interested in his history. And so it's essentially a good way to test people of their knowledge of Albert Einstein. we could imagine that there are people who major in the life and times of Albert Einstein, and all throughout the world, and we would give them the 1,000 approximate lines in this code, and maybe they can wear Oculus Rift glasses, and they can start to connect. Well, Einstein's first wife was Mileva. They had 3 kids. His second wife was that. He wrote President Roosevelt a letter for the Manhattan Project, and start connecting these things. And then we would begin to understand this. We would get a distribution of the understanding, the effective understanding of these history majors. Okay, that's kind of a contrived experiment, but we can also imagine doing military entrance exams, the ASVABs, where you have a portion of it where you put on your goggles and you, at the recruiters, and you start connecting things on geography and world history and or electronics and or computers, and you would get a battery of results that would indicate where this person's effective skills are at. I call it an effective operational intelligence. So in the picture you're seeing here is I have one of these supposed future life and times and science historians of Albert Einstein, and when she's a young girl, the topology that she knows of Einstein is very weak, and there are these algebraic invariants called Betty numbers which measure how many are just dots and how many are linked. And then as she gets older, if this is the time axis, she begins putting more connections together, and you start to have holes through this plane, and the Betty numbers start to pick up the holes. And then she starts to build tetrahedrons, and those are two-dimensional. Those are holes inside a three-dimensional object. And it continues to go this way. And Betty numbers are actually 4 or 5 n-dimensional structures. As long as the edges and vertices are connected in the right way, you can have a 4-dimensional hypercube, projected by its labels in this kind of way. And so we would get a rich time evolution of the effective Einstein science history intelligence of this young woman getting her bachelor's in Einstein or her master's in Einstein. Perhaps more than just this operational approach, we can upgrade from the IQ test in which each human is assigned a number that falls on a two-dimensional distribution normal curve. Perhaps we can begin to develop a science of intelligence that's based on how we understand the world through its networks. And I think that we would be richer for it. Now, I want to say that recently, the field theorists who study quantum fields and particles, and mathematicians as well, have developed many, many invariants, not just the Betty numbers, but invariant polynomials that characterize graphs. And so we would have a portfolio, a battery of tests to characterize us as human beings. So we would have the Jones polynomial, the Alexander polynomial, Betty numbers, the graph entropy, and a dozen to hundreds of other graph invariants to say, this is who I am at 50, having gotten my PhD in physics back in 2000. And so, we could begin to measure high school kids that are going to attending poor schools versus rich schools around different parts of the world. We could actually begin to characterize our populations this way, more than just some silly IQ test or really unpopular tests that are currently out there, ineffective in my opinion for measuring people. And while we're at it, if general artificial intelligence ever does happen, well, here would be a way to characterize it, how unique or how similar it is to us. I personally don't know if we are sufficiently intelligent to be able to create general artificial intelligence on our own, other than by, say, in hardware and or in software, literally putting together brains statistically and functionally that look like ours, except they're in silico, or they're in silicon, and they begin to learn like us because they're physically implemented or they are represented as if physically implemented. I'm not sure if we can do it algorithmically. I hope you've been inspired by this approach to capturing something of what it means to be human, to have had a human life, and persist through a few decades in your city and your state and your country, and maybe have ideas on modeling reality or virtual reality. We're all connected in many ways beyond the internet. Sometimes I think about, I studied particle physics in grad school, that what if at the subatomic scale, a weak decay in a banana, in a radioactive carbon atom, happened as Steve Jobs was eating his breakfast, banana, and it's the one that caused the cancer. So something way down in the weeds network, quantum field and particle network, affected one of the most inspirational and important drivers of new technology for the whole planet. So sometimes, network linkages can happen across. Sometimes it can happen across very large scale differences. Thank you.